Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So this is part 2 of our Quantifying and Managing Throwing Workload series. If you missed part 1, check out the link for that. You might want to go back and watch that video because it's going to give you the necessary kind of background information for this video to make sense, okay? But, so assuming you watched that, today we're going to talk about how to deload and reload throwing safely and effectively to kind of maximize performance and reduce injury risk as much as possible. So we're going to talk about 3 different options: a 25% reduction in throwing load, 50% reduction in throwing load, and a complete shutdown. All right, so you'll kind of make your decision which you want to do based on a couple of factors. 1, how fatigued or fresh you are, okay? 2, your relative performance level to other people your age. So how good are you compared to your high school class, college class, the other pros you're competing against, whatever that may be. And then the final factor is kind of whenever your next competition season is likely to begin, because we can kind of back it up from there and know what you have to be ready for. And depending on the timeline, that may kind of determine what you actually are able to do safely. Okay, so let's talk about the first option, a deload with a 25% reduction in your throwing load, okay? So if we reduce your throwing load by 25%, you're gonna need a minimum of 2 weeks to build that back up. So let's assume that your chronic throwing load is 600 arbitrary units based on throwing 5 days a week, 80 to 120 throws per day, and 1 to 2 high intensity days per week. Okay, a 25% reduction brings us to 450, all right, 450 arbitrary units. In order to kind of reload safely to 600, you should not exceed an acute increase in throwing by more than 30%. All right, so this means 135 throws per week is the most you can really add to kind of fully reload. Okay, so practically this is kind of going to look like, hey, you reduce your number of throwing days from 5 to 4 in week 1, you cap the throwing intensity at 80% throwing velocity or a 7 to 7.5 RPE. In week 2 of the deload, you'll add the 5th throwing day back in or increase the volume of the 4 days. You may reach an intensity of about 90% or so, or an 8 to 8.5 RPE. By week 3, your volume will be back to its pre-deload level, and intensity can return as well. So this is not a significant decrease in throwing load. This is a small deload that may be done during, like, the break between your college and summer season, for example. Maybe a time for that if you're fatigued from the college season to some degree, but you're still required to play summer ball or whatever, which is a whole different conversation. But if you are, that may be the time to do it, and then still have you ready for that season to come. Okay, so our second option is a 50% reduction in throwing load for this deload. All right, so this is going to take a minimum of 3 weeks to kind of rebuild the throwing load that you had previously. So in terms of practical application, in week 1 you may reduce your throwing frequency from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. That may be a good place to start. You'll cap your throwing intensity 70% of max velocity or 5.5 RPE. Week 2, you'll add the 4th day back in. You'll increase throwing intensity to 80% max velocity, 6.5 to 7 RPE, somewhere around there. Week 3, add the 5th day of throwing back in. Increase throwing intensity to 90% max velocity, 8.5 RPE. And then by week 4, your volume will be back to its pre-deload, and your intensity can return as well. So this may be an option if you have, your off season is not that long. It's coming up. You threw a fair number of innings this year, but not like an exceptionally large amount. And you're behind in terms of some kind of performance aspect, whether it's velocity or whatever it might be. So you need to develop in the off season, but you also need some time away from high intensity throwing just for health and fatigue purposes. This may be a good option in that scenario because it does give you a break from high intensity throwing without getting so far away that we're taking a ton of time to kind of get back up to a full intensity and kind of back to that development cycle that you really need to kind of get to the next level. So our final option, and our kind of most extreme in terms of the rest kind of deload options, is complete rest, all right? So a complete shutdown is gonna take a little bit longer to come back from. And it's really going to be based on how long you shut down for, right? If you're shutting down for a week, right, you can come back in 2 to 4 weeks, all right? If you're shutting down for 2 weeks or more, it's going to be at least 4 weeks before you can get back. And when we're talking about what's the bare minimum length of time it's going to take to get back, 4 weeks can return your throwing load back to some degree. But really, if we're talking about stepping on the mound and being ready again, bare minimum we'd like to have 6, right? We can get your throwing load back and be ready for high intensity throwing again at 4, but you really don't have any high intensity throwing under your belt at that point. So from there, the 6 weeks would give us an additional 2 to do full intensity throwing. If you're going to be ready to pitch from the mound at this point, to be ready to kind of get back on the mound and compete at a high level as safely as possible, right? This is not having a full development cycle or anything like that. So if you're going to take the complete rest, you really want to kind of have planned out your off season already to make sure you have enough time to take however much time off you're going to. We don't want to be in a rush to get ready for the next season, competitive event, whatever it is, after we've taken time off, right? It's a big mistake I see a lot of guys make, and they get in this cycle of kind of injury or pain or whatever it might be because they ramp back up too quickly to too high of an effort. They go to a showcase and they shut down again, take more time off, and then they got to get back ready for another showcase. That's not the way to do it at all. We want to make sure we have these kind of logical periods of in-season, off-season, where we're kind of either throwing more or less, working on specific goals, whatever it might be. So if you're going to take a complete shutdown, be ready for how long it's going to take you to ramp back up, and make sure you've thought about how long you can actually take off and still be ready for your next competitive event. All right? So that kind of concludes the deload and reload kind of education here. But what I would say is, if you're interested in kind of tracking your throwing load, you're thinking about doing this, you're not really sure how to quantify it, if you haven't already, go ahead and download our free tracking tool. Once you put in the numbers, it will do all the math for you. It'll calculate the rolling averages and everything, so you know what your acute to chronic workload ratio is, and you know how you can kind of safely increase your throwing load week to week, session to session, whatever it might be. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them below. If you're interested in in-person or remote training, feel free to reach out to us with an email, and then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.